Hello, you're listening to the Citizen Truth Podcast. We're excited today to speak with Dr. Peter Phillips, professor of sociology at Sonoma State University and author of the book Giants, the Global Power Elite. Dr. Phillips has extensively laid out power networks at the heights of global capitalism, demonstrating the extensive interconnections among the largest transnational financial firms, corporations, media outlets, think tanks, and other influential institutions. Thanks for speaking to us today, Dr. Phillips.
Well, thank you very much, Peter. I'm glad to be on with you.
So one of the major institutions you analyze in Giants is NATO and the closely related foreign policy think tank, the Atlantic Council. I was hoping you could discuss your view of the Atlantic Council in relation to the ongoing crisis in Ukraine, its influence on Western media coverage of the crisis and relations with Russia in general, and how this relates to the interests of transnational asset managed firms and other special interests involved.
Well, the Atlantic Council, which was formed in 61, has been the primary advisory group to NATO, and it's kind of like the Trilateral Commission. They've got people from all over the world on the Atlantic Council board, but it's mostly American. It's mostly people who are concerned with high-level security. And that means protecting the dollar overseas. It means protecting US economic growth and expansion, and labeling oppositions such as Russia and China very negatively, and calling for NATO to engage with regime change whenever possible, or certainly the threat thereof. And they laid out quite directly that they wanted to remove Putin. This was 6 years ago, that they wanted to remove Putin. They wanted to have a regime change in Russia and open up the vast resources of Russia and Siberia and their huge to raw material collection and investment by elite capitalist investment firms. They've got more money than they have places to do an investment. So they'd like to see China and Russia opened up to US capital investment.
Okay.
So the strategy the strategy is, one, to get a regime change in Russia, which they thought they had 20 years ago. And Yeltsin died, and Putin came to power, and the billionaires that took over the resources of Russia have backed Putin quite strongly. And that's who's being targeted now with this US sanctions and the war in Ukraine. NATO and the strategists, they wanted a war. They wanted Russia to engage and have a war. It's very profitable. Lockheed Martin's shares have risen 28% just in the last 3 weeks. So it's quite, it's war is very profitable. And then ideologically, having a new Hitler in the world, which, even the Atlantic Council on their website, they have a half a face of Putin and a half a face of Hitler. And, so they're saying, we have this new Hitler, which is, to say he's beyond redeeming. And he knows all this stuff, he sees it, and of course, feels very threatened by it. And that was one of the reasons that they took a firm stand with Ukraine, because NATO has occupied involved all of the former Soviet Union countries, and encircled Russia even to a greater degree with US-made weapons. So Lockheed Martin makes a lot of money when a country like Ukraine would decide to go with NATO and change that. So they're in line. It's capital growth and expansion. In the case of Ukraine, there was a pro-Russian government there, which was overthrown in a coup, financed and paid for by the US 5-6 years ago. And since then, the CIA knew that Russia would never give up Crimea. That was one of their major naval warm water ports for their navy. They knew that there was no way they would ever give that up. So they called when the Crimea separated from Ukraine, it was kind of artificially placed there by the Soviet Union a long time ago. When they separated from Ukraine, mostly and voted 90% to be independent or be part of Russia, the US was saying, oh, the Russians invaded the Crimea. Well, they never invaded. They had bases there already. They didn't have to invade. 90% of the population was Russian. And, they had a huge, statement that they were not going to give up. But then you got this pro-US, pro-NATO response saying Russia is committing atrocities and moving over in terms of trying to control and reestablish the USSR. It hasn't emerged that way. But certainly the Russians felt, as there was a coup in Ukraine, that if they lost Ukraine, which was a vast territory with 40 million plus people right on their borders and had been part of Russia for decades, certainly a century, they weren't going to let it go. And they knew that would ultimately lead to a conflict. And and NATO was encouraging this conflict. The Atlantic Council was encouraging this conflict and making every effort to see that happen, with knowing full well that they would be able to demonize Putin and hopefully bankrupt Russia through sanctions and the expense of the war that was going to be involved, let alone providing Ukraine with massive numbers of weapons that can knock out tanks and Stinger missiles and the Javelin. Thousands of those have gone into Ukraine so that foot soldiers can fight tanks. So it's a mess. I'm very concerned about it. I'm worried that it will escalate into nuclear exchanges. Russia's already warned about that. And I'm concerned that the US, it's kind of a race against the Russian government as to whether or not they will collapse or be pushed out before the nuke weapons start flying. And that, to me, is a very dangerous situation.
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned Lockheed Martin. I believe the 1998 committee for NATO expansion was chaired by a former executive of Lockheed Martin. So,
Lockheed Martin has been very deeply involved in NATO, because when a new country comes in, they're obligated to spend 2% of their budget on military growth and expansion annually. And that money a whole lot of that money gets spent with Lockheed Martin and Northrop Grumman, who provide them the standardized weaponry that NATO uses. So it's a military marketplace expansion is what it becomes.
Yeah. And that leads me well into my next question, which was, I wanted to ask your view of the ongoing economic decoupling between the US and Russia and how that would impact the transnational capitalist class. For example, if you think the transnational asset management firms will operate within the framework of US strategic interest, or more so primarily their own economic interests. Like BlackRock, for example, the CEO is on the board of Larry Fink is on the board of the Council on Foreign Relations, but has extensive investments in China, for example. As this kind of new Cold War progresses, do you see them?
BlackRock opened office in Beijing like 5 years ago, and they have been seeking, Chinese capital and capital worldwide that they can control investments. 5 years ago, five years ago, BlackRock was at 4 trillion management. Today they're at 8. So they've massively increased the amounts of capital that they invest and control. Their biggest problem, however, is finding safe harbors for capital investment. And having a war opens up a whole new parameters of available investment opportunities. And if Russia if you were able to have a regime change there, BlackRock would be one of the leaders marching into Moscow to buy up resources in the Soviet Union to invest in. So they're hopeful that they will see a regime change, but Putin has resisted that, and in support by Russian billionaires. But in doing so, he's brought betterment to the working people in Russia and really kind of reversed what was a tragic downturn in terms of middle class survival and income that happened after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So poverty massively increased, and Putin has been able to reverse that and bring about greater opportunities for the working people in Russia, as has China. And they have made huge strides in terms of developing a middle class and allowing betterment for the people there. So you have two regimes that are very strongly supported by the mass people in the country, because things have gotten better vis-a-vis the US, where we're seeing a decline, increase in poverty and a decline in working class incomes and opportunities. So they keep telling us, well, that's, we need better investment opportunities and that, but that's to protect BlackRock and Larry Fink and all of the 13, 17 giants that I talked about in my book, Giants, are these big capital investment companies that have over $1 trillion in investment assets. That's doubled in just 5 years. So this concentration of capital moving back in, worldwide in just smaller numbers of owners and managed centrally by just a few hundred people, dominates the political process, and places like NATO and the Atlantic Council and the Trilateral Commission are setting policies to continue that expansion and growth, and connected with media to propagandize us into their point of view of what's happening. The media, currently how they cover, especially CNN, how they're covering the war in Ukraine, it's all about the victims and the families that are being impacted, which is true. It's very, very tragic. But Putin wasn't unprovoked. I think there was a general desire by NATO to get Putin involved in a war there, that they could demonize him and risk a nuclear holocaust worldwide, in the hopes that he would be pushed out by the fear that that kind of war would happen.
You just discussed, like in Giants, you lay out the 17 major transnational asset management firms that hold majority shares in all types of corporations, such as defense contractors and media conglomerates.
Anywhere they can make money, all the major corporations they're invested in.
Absolutely, but that's like one major conflict of interest in their coverage of foreign policy. Something that I wasn't as aware of until reading your book was the influence of these PR firms like Omnicom Group and Interpublic Group, and how they influence public perception. Could you talk a little bit about that to maybe help people understand?
Well, Omnicom, WPP, and Interpublic Group are the three largest public relation firms in the world. And in the book, we have lists of hundreds and hundreds of companies that they manage, the press releases and public statements, and it implies and clearly shows that the major media in the country, which is also owned by Northrop Grumman and owned by BlackRock and those investment companies, is facing a propaganda control mechanism to keep the American people in the world misinformed about what the purposes are and direction that they're planning to go. So it's private capital publicly pronouncing how wonderful they are, and media under the thumb of these investors completely goes along with it. And you can't believe literally that anything that's in US corporate media today. It's not fully presented in an objective way. It has an agenda, and that agenda is to demonize opposition and to praise the American direction that we're going.
Another influential global power elite group that you touch on and discuss in Giants is the World Economic Forum, which has gained a lot of attention in the COVID era. For example, with Klaus Schwab's Great Reset and the Young Leaders Program, which features a lot of major prominent officials. Could you explain maybe what role that group, you perceive that group playing in the international system?
Well, the annual meetings in Davos, major corporations in the world are allowed to send 5 representatives. And except one of those has to be a woman. So that's their affirmative action aspect of this. And they meet for several days. And it's like a big, conference. There's speeches and talks and planning sessions and a variety of other things. And if you can't afford that, or you're a young 30-year-old that's working for a corporation somewhere or independently engaged, they will pay your way. They will pay you to come. And that's the part of the scholars. There's about 10,000 people that have been invited and involved in that. And that is the group that the Great Reset is hoping will lead a forward movement in the world to reset global capital, to continue to allow private capital to dominate and rule, but try to get them to do it in a more humane way. So they want, Lockheed Martin to be nicer to the world, but at the same time to continue to sell weapons and make a lot of money and concentrate wealth. So the Great Reset from the World Economic Forum is about protecting global capital's continuation of the dominant source of power in the world. And that's terrifying to me. You've got private entities in a very concentrated, small number of people involved. I mean, it's a few thousand, dominated by their policy boards of just 50 or 100 people, all of whom are deeply invested in the major investment companies. They're all multimillionaires. And it's their way of life that they're seeking to protect and continue. And they realized that there were difficulties that they faced. Investment opportunities was one of their biggest, but then the crisis of the global environment, environmental destruction that we're all very worried about, they wanted to be able to address it. I don't think they know how to fix it, but they certainly want to be able to address it and slow it down and try to claim that they're doing something about it. The same way with war. War is justified if you have an evil Hitler that you have to take out and engage with. And that becomes even more dangerous for us. So we're faced with economic collapse. You can't continue to concentrate wealth indefinitely in the world and expect that not to collapse at some point. You have to have a return on your investments. If that return is not there, you end up with stagnation. That ends up with mass unemployment and civil unrest. So they're doing everything they can to try to delay that as long as possible.
Okay, great. And then just my last question would be the role of the tech giants, which you also touch on in Giants, and their influence with the Atlantic Council and major media conglomerates, and how that could also be influencing public perception of this Ukraine crisis and other major current affairs.
Well, the tech giants are places where capital is being invested in a massive way and getting huge returns. It's like anything else, can't continue ad infinitum to concentrate wealth in that way. And there's some limit to how rich Bezos can be and the other, managers of global capital through the tech companies. But Google and Facebook, and those are taking up a huge domination of human thinking. I probably didn't say that very eloquently, but that's exactly what it is.
I agree.
It's a frame. It's a frame for understanding what's going on. Well, let's Google that and find out what the truth is. If anything, you get huge misrepresentations of what's really going on and disinformation that leaves us completely unaware of the degree to which global capital is controlling us. And I think that's very important to try to understand. So Giants was meant to be a structural understanding of how capital is concentrated. We're looking quite closely at who are the instigators of that and who are the people involved. And in an update I'm doing, we'll look at how the 300 people who were there have changed somewhat. There's some have died and moved on or retired, and then new ones come in that look exactly like the ones that were there before. So they're Harvard, Yale, Princeton people and other elite universities from around the world. And they're all millionaires and represent their transnational capital class existence. When we say transnational capital class, we mean people with similar lifestyles, working in the major cities of the world, controlling huge amounts of capital, and diminishing life's livability for 80% of the people. See, 80% of the people in the world make less than $10 a day. It's quite amazing. And half the world makes less than a couple dollars a day. So this inequality of wealth is so immense. They don't want to talk about it. They want to keep saying, well, it's going to trickle down. It's going to be better. It's going to, we'll have capital growth and people will be able to take opportunities. That's not happening. The reverse is happening. The bottom 2/3 of the world's population are worse off than they were 10 years ago, 20 years ago. And that is increasingly happening for people worldwide. Where it's not happening is Russia and China, as much as they can do, but they have limited resources to be able to continue to do that. And we are trying to overwhelm them with capital investment and threats of war. And we will do covert operations. I mean, if assassinations are not unheard of inside the U.S. military-industrial complex on behalf of global capital.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Phillips. And I really recommend to listeners the book Giants, the Global Power Elite, which really puts in detail the structural forces of our global system and names of who might be influencing our views or the information we're presented with to try and make sense of the world. So thanks so much for talking to us, Dr.
Well,
Phillips.
Peter, thank you for having me. I really appreciate what you're doing, and I hope you keep at it.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Take
Hopefully
care.